welcome to episode 18 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. I'm excited for this conversation today with Dr. John Stackhouse. John is a professor just down the road, actually, from where I am, in the same town in Moncton, New Brunswick, at Crandall University, which is a Baptist-run university in the town of Moncton. And yet he is brilliant and a well-published scholar, done lots of things, and is a kind of a global authority on evangelicalism in general, and then in particular Canadian evangelicalism. You could say he wrote the book on it, and in fact we're going to hear a little bit about that. Let me just kind of caveat right at the very top, at the end of this conversation I say something to the effect of, because this was recorded about 2 weeks ago, I said I don't know what the world is going to be like in 2 weeks, and little did I know how little I knew what the world was going to be like in 2 weeks. And so I know that a lot of our hearts and minds are kind of wrapped up in what's going on in Ukraine. Now, I don't know if you're going to be listening to this in real time as it's being released to the world on February 25th or at some time in the future. Just know that we're not blind to the fact that this is what's going on. And in fact, obviously we don't get into geopolitics very much. We don't really talk about the military. We talk about theology. We talk about the Bible. And one of the things we do talk about is the idea that we can become pretty focused in our own little bubbles in terms of the Western world of thought, and being open to how the rest of the world interacts with the Bible, how they interact with Christianity, and hearing from them rather than just trying to export our ideas to them, but hearing from them is a theme that is trying to catch steam here in North America, and yet also has some pushback against it. And so this would be a really good time for us to for me personally, to have my eyes opened to how people who are suffering right now, kind of in Ukraine and in Russia, kind of in both sides of the struggle, how they might be dealing with this, and how their faith, such to the degree that they have it, might be informing their response. I didn't prepare anything to say here, and so if I go off cuff, I apologize, but I must admit that when I see pray for Ukraine signs, I wonder if they're just as much of a flashpoint, or could create the same kind of flashpoint as Black Lives Matter signs did a little while ago. And by that I mean, it's indisputable, it feels indisputable that Black lives matter, and yet for some strange reason there were some people who did dispute the usage of the language because they wanted to say something to the effect of all lives matter. And when they pushed back with that, some people were offended by the pushback, and it was sort of this kind of back and forth that was going on, where people were sometimes saying the same thing and hearing it in very different ways. And I do wonder if in some respects, when we're going to see a lot of these in the coming days, what we should be seeing is people asking us to pray for the people of Ukraine. Some of my admittedly kind of liberal bias will push back and say we should also be praying for the people of Russia. In fact, just this last week, Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, got raked over the coals pretty bad for asking people to pray for Putin. Now, this was right before Putin had actually essentially taken this definitive step towards war. And it was a lot of people saying, how could you ask us to pray for Putin? We should be praying for the victims. Which again, you can understand the impulse to say, don't pray for the victimizer, pray for the victims. It just brought to mind, the words of Jesus that says, pray for your enemies. You've heard it say, love your friends and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, can you do both? Do all lives matter, or do Black lives matter? Yes and yes. Is the statement required still when you're being persecuted and you need somebody to come and help you from the outside? Yes. Should we be praying for Ukraine? Yes. It's a really complicated time. It's obviously probably a lot less complicated if you're the one who's suffering shelling on the ground. And so this sounds a lot like it's a bunch of hyperbole and hypothesizing and philosophizing and blah, blah, blah. But I do think it matters, because how we approach this as Christians, if that happens to be what you consider yourself to be, is going to have a lot of effect about how people view this sort of victim-victimizer kind of relationship. And so I am praying for the people of Ukraine. And I am praying for the people of Russia, those who are actively trying to hurt the people of Ukraine. I'm praying that they would stop. And those who are sort of wrapped up in the geopolitical world that they have no desire to be a part of, but they're simply following along. I'm praying for them. And I'm praying that the animating forces of darkness that are kind of behind all of this death and destruction, that they would ultimately be defeated in the name of Jesus Christ. And so that was off the cuff, and I hope I didn't say anything that will get me in trouble. Hope you hear my heart in this. That's not at all what we talk about in this podcast conversation. We talk about evangelicalism. He tries to kind of diagnose me and determine whether or not I'm an evangelical. Stay tuned. We'll see. We also talk an eensy-weensy bit about a book that he's just recently published, which is really cool. You're going to enjoy that. So that's enough preamble from me. Here we go. Well, hello, welcome everyone, and welcome to you, Professor Stackhouse. Now, as a Canadian, do you often get people who call you Stack Maison instead of Stackhouse?
Not very often, and not usually more than once. No, but I think it's la maison de souche or something like that en français. But mon français est très mauvais, so even though we're in Moncton, we better keep it in English.
We'll keep it Anglo. Okay, perfect. We're chatting briefly before this, and we mentioned how both of us are in the same city, which is a kind of an unusual occurrence in some respects. So even though Zoom does make it easy to record a conversation, whether or not you happen to be in the same hemisphere or the same street. So it's convenient to be able to have this conversation with you. But also, even though we're in the same city, you and I have not really rubbed shoulders or interacted very much before. And so it's kind of like it's a bit of a blind date. So Professor Stackhouse, would you start by telling me a little bit of like who you are and what's your history and kind of how have you arrived where you have today?
Well, I'm grateful to be professor of religious studies at Crandall University here in Moncton, which is one of the two local universities. One is a provincial university, l'Université de Moncton, which is francophone, as you might have guessed. We instruct in English, but the particular mission of Crandall University comes from it being an arm of the Baptists of Atlantic Canada. Originally a Bible school for keen Christians, it's now an undergraduate, primarily university, with some graduate programs in business and leadership that's aimed really at, I think, three audiences, Mark. We try very hard to continue to disciple keen Christians at the university level. We try to evangelize people who come who are interested in the gospel. We're happy to do that. If they'll listen to us, we'll offer them Jesus as we can. But then thirdly, we try to show hospitality to our fellow Monctonians and Maritimers, Canadians, and people now from several dozen other countries who come to want what we offer, a good, fairly classical liberal arts Christian education. And they more or less put up with the Christian parts in order to get what they hope will be a good education from us. So this is the real creative challenge that's been interesting for me to come to, because my background is in both secular and Christian higher education, but I've never been in a school that tried to do this combination of things. My first experience out of high school was at a little Bible school in the Canadian prairies for a year. And then my undergraduate degree in history is from Queen's University in Ontario. Then my master's degree is from Wheaton College in the suburbs of Chicago, which is a fairly serious Christian school that you have to say you're a Christian to come to, even as a student. And then my final degree was at the University of Chicago, again, in this case, a private university that has Baptist roots, but hasn't been seriously Christian for generations. And then I've taught at Christian colleges in the States, small colleges like ours, Wheaton College for a while, Northwestern College in Iowa. But then I spent 8 years at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, kind of a big general purpose Canadian university, engineering school, law school, medical school, and so on. I taught in the religion department there. Cut my teeth there, Mark. Actually, that was where I had to go through promotion from assistant to associate professor and from associate to full professor. That's where I had to get tenure. So all of those challenges in a professor's life I went through as a Christian at a secular university. And then for over 15 years, I taught at Regent College, which is a Christian graduate school on the campus of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So only in the last 5 years have I come out now, in a sense, full circle to a small, intentionally Christian university that is trying to address all the audiences that I have talked to before, but all in one place. And so it's quite a creative challenge for us all to try to do those three jobs well.
No doubt. So obviously, some time in the States, but a lot of time in Canada. Where were you born?
I was born in Kingston, Ontario. My dad actually went to the Queen's Medical School. And so I was born just as he was finishing his MD. But then I learned to speak actually in southwestern England. I was from age 2 to 5, lived in Plymouth, and my parents have recordings of me with a deliciously thick English accent. And then we came back to Ontario, and that accent got pounded out of me on the schoolyard. So I grew up in Northern Ontario, and then I married pretty young and moved to the States for about 10 years. So now my accent hovers somewhere over the Canadian-American border, as you can tell. I've got a little bit of Americanadian in with the way I speak, but have been back in Canada, as I say, since I was 30. So now I'm certainly not that, and glad to be back here, and actually to live in the Maritimes for the first time. I visited out here a few times, lectured at Acadia and out near Dalhousie, and then out here to Crandall for a while. And then when the call came to me actually to come out and try to help Crandall get better. It's a university on the grow, and they're trying to improve their academic standards. So I have a part-time job there, Mark, along with my professorship. So I'm a bit of a player coach. So they invented a second job for me called Dean of Faculty Development. My job is to coach the faculty to become better teachers. They're already pretty good, but help them get better, and to help people with research. It's been my privilege to do a fair bit of writing at the scholarly level and in more public media. So I will coach individual faculty members, and I'll also do in-service presentations to the faculty to try to help this small school grow up into a real university. So that's been a lot of fun with people who are eager to learn. So it's been a good team to join.
Cool. It seems like Crandall kind of does punch above its weight in terms of having a really great faculty, and then obviously a kind of what seems like a pretty broad range of offerings academically for the size of school that it is. And so that's probably a lot to bite off, though. So the more things that is on your menu, kind of at your restaurant, kind of the more challenging it can be to make sure that all those things are delicious and nutritious for you, right? So I'm sure that can kind of be a bit of a challenge. One thing is, like, what are religious studies? Like, what is that? What does that mean?
Well, in a place like the University of Manitoba, or a place like Mount Allison University down the road, religious studies is the interdisciplinary study of the phenomenon of religion. See, some university departments are characterized by how they look at things. So historians look at things historically. Sociologists look at things sociologically, right? Chemists look at things chemically. Those are particular disciplines or ways of studying certain subject matter, humans or the natural world. In the case of certain other fields, there's a subject matter that you get at from different disciplines. Think of a geography department. Some of them are geologists, and some of them are, in a sense, historians, and some of them are into climate. In our case, we're interested in the phenomenon of religion. What is it, and how do we study it? So some people are historians, some people are linguists, some people are ritual studies experts, some people are philosophers. Now at Crandall, frankly, it's a department of Christian studies in all but name, because we're part of the larger Canadian university fraternity, so to speak. Religious studies is the safe, neutral, kind of non-confessional approach. But frankly, most of our offerings are in the Christian Bible, in the Christian doctrine, in Christian tradition. And I think we offer a few courses, not just one or two, but we offer a few courses in the more generic study of religion, sociology of religion, psychology of religion. I myself teach world religions. So as I say, certainly the center of gravity for us is in Christianity. Whereas if you went to a place like Wilfrid Laurier University, which has a fairly good-sized religious studies department, they would range right across the world religions and interdisciplinary studies as well.
So what's your tool? Like, how did you come into, or what's the one thing that's sort of in your belt when you were in the religious studies department? Or what were you most known for, I guess? Because probably now you carry a bunch of tools, but what was the one that were like, Stackhouse, this is the guy for this?
Well, most people in the academy have one thing they do really well. The academy really rewards specialization. I'm a bit of an exception to that rule, for better and for worse, because I used to be a real scholar. I like to say I used to be somebody who did one thing really well, and what I was trained at was history, and the history particularly of Christianity in the modern world, more particularly the history of Protestantism in North America, more particularly still the history of evangelicalism in Canada. So my first book with the University of Toronto Press is the first book on evangelicalism in Canada in the 20th century. It was published, 30 years ago now. And I like to say it's the best book ever published on the subject, which it is. It's also the worst book ever published on the subject. And to this day, I am Canada's and the world's authority on evangelicalism in Canada in the 20th century from a historical point of view. And literally recently wrote an article in a big international resource volume. 7 volumes actually coming out of the University of Edinburgh Press. And I was asked to write the chapter on Anglophone Canadian Christianity, because again, I remain one of the handful of people, a few sociologists, a couple of historians, who know the recent history of Canadian Protestantism and evangelicalism in particular pretty well. But half of my training actually was in theology and philosophy. And as I say, the academy doesn't usually reward you for doing more than one thing well, but I got jobs at University of Manitoba and Regent and here at Crandall that let me do more than one thing. So of the, 8 or 9 or 10 books that I published, more than half of them would be in Christian theology and ethics, some in apologetics. My most recent book is an attempt to offer the grounds for Christian faith to thoughtful non-Christians. So it's been good to be a sort of a utility infielder in a department where I have an Old Testament specialist and a New Testament specialist. And in a sense, I do almost everything else. So I do Christian theology, I do philosophy of religion, I do world religions, and teach on ethics. And so I've been able to stitch together a career as somebody who does interdisciplinary work and does work in several fields. It's going to mean, Mark, that I'm never going to leave Crandall for Yale. Oxford's never going to come calling, because those fields where I have friends teaching are fields in which you've got to be the world's expert on this. But on the other hand, at Crandall, there's never a dull moment, because I'm constantly changing fields and disciplines and conversations, and that's pretty fun too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Whenever I think of that, I always think of like, I don't watch it much at all anymore, and I only watched it a little bit before. But I think of UFC, kind of Ultimate Fighting, and how these people are multidisciplinarians, right? Like, so they do like, Brazilian jiu-jitsu and they do judo, and you can kind of look at it and go, is this the death of is this fusion food to the fact that, what I keep talking about food, but like, like now it's like, it tastes like nothing or whatever, like these things have completely obliterated. But actually, when you look into it, these guys actually do still work really hard in their disciplines. They just synthesize their disciplines in different ways. And so, but like you say, a specialist, you can understand how somebody, if they were a specialist in something, they can only be a specialist in that thing as long as they keep devoting almost all of their time to that thing, right? Because people are publishing more and more content every single day, and if you're not constantly combing over and reading the articles that nobody wants to read about, it's probably pretty tough to remain the leading authority on that thing.
No, it's quite true, although I'm certainly going to delight in using the UFC analogy now henceforth to describe what I do. But you're quite right. And so what I've ended up doing, Mark, is tackling pretty big subjects that require an interdisciplinary approach. So I've written books on, for instance, the Christian understanding of how men and women should relate to each other in the home and the church and society. I've written books on how to offer our faith to other people in what's called apologetics. I've written books of very fundamental ethics. What does it mean to be a human being and a Christian in the world, according to the Bible? Why are we here? What are we here to do? What's God want with us? Well, these fairly gigantic questions, of course, I can't fully answer, but I've gone at them with a combination of history, theology, and philosophy. Those are my three main ways of getting at things, with some sociology mixed in as well. And to do that kind of thing, you really can't be a specialist. You really do have to be conversant with several disciplines. And to keep myself honest, then I have people who are still experts read my stuff before I launch to the public and say, check my work. I know I'm not reading everything that everybody has written on this. I can't possibly do that. But have I missed anybody I really should read? Am I missing some argument that I really should know? And occasionally I do. It's not like I always do get it right. Sometimes they say, yeah, if you're going to write about this, you need to read so-and-so. You need to look at such and such. But generally, that passes muster. And if you're going to do the kind of work I do, the way that I keep myself honest is to get wise friends in the disciplines to check my work before I set it free in public. And so far, so good. That's worked pretty well.
That's smart. That's good. I do want to talk about your book, which you've alluded to a couple of times here. This kind of what seems like a pretty unique apologetic approach in some respects. Although, full disclosure, I was able to get this book from you a few days ago, and so I have read a number of words. A number of words have been read. The table of contents being some of those words, but I also read the opening and the closing. It's a little bit of a trick. You can kind of get the gist of what's going on, but I do look forward to actually digging into it. But one of the things, even before we go there, and we talked about beforehand, it's hard to say who listens to this. Definitely some people who are kind of entrenched Christians. Definitely some people who are certainly not. There's no real demographic. Sometimes I'm talking to a biblical scholar. Sometimes I'm talking to a musician. Sometimes I'm talking to somebody who is a culinary artist. And so it's just talking. But one of the things that's fascinating, especially to somebody who is a Christian, maybe somebody who spent a lot of their life in the church, when all of a sudden you find out that there are like published and tenured biblical scholars who don't claim to be Christian in any way, like that can be like a jarring realization for them, or they're just like when you first run into like the adjective confessional in front of like an academic, and you're just like, what does that mean? I just assumed if you were going to be writing about Jesus or writing about the Bible, that in some ways you would believe in Jesus or whatever it means to believe in the Bible, right? These would just kind of be assumptions that a lot of people would carry. Was that at the time? I mean, obviously this is a long time ago for you at this point, but I mean, was that surprising for you? And then how have you navigated kind of being like in a really rigorous academic world and yet being a confession, which I presume that you are, a confessional Christian at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nobody ever devotes themselves to a subject that they don't find fascinating. It's just too much work.
Right.
So one, I suppose, could imagine somebody studying the Bible who wasn't a Christian, but I can't imagine anybody studying, for instance, slavery in the United States at the time of the Civil War who didn't have pretty strong moral feelings about slavery. Like you just wouldn't do that, right? Why would you spend your time on that? So it's always interesting to find out who's so interested in the Christian scriptures that they want to spend their time studying it, even though they aren't themselves church-going Christians. And usually you don't have to go very far in the biography to find out that the person used to be a Christian. Or they grew up in a Christian home and found it oppressive. And so now they have their own personal interest. I won't say necessarily a crusade against Christianity, although often they do. But it's not usually somebody getting involved in something that's as emotionally and morally charged as the Christian religion as a subject, whereas other people might study butterflies and study it quite seriously because it's wonderful and beautiful and interesting, but they don't have any strong moral feelings one way or the other about it. but that subject matter doesn't lend itself to it the same way. Quite apart from global warming moral considerations. Generally, you study Lepidoptera because you're just fascinated by insects. So I think that's right. And when I was studying at the University of Chicago, I found, and this was at the time would be one of the top 3 or 4 places in the world to study religion in terms of quality and also in terms of quantity. Lots and lots of people study religion in the Chicago area because it's full of colleges and Bible schools and seminaries and universities. Almost all of my classmates were serious Christians, had been serious Christians, were on their way out of being serious Christians, or were on their way, in many cases, to redefining Christianity in a way that they could find more acceptable. And in fact, liberal Christianity, which is what dominated the University of Chicago Divinity School, is a way of trying to eat your cake and have it too, in my view. I know that's not terribly charitable, but in my view, liberal Christianity is a way of trying to retain what you want to keep of the Christian tradition, and that varies with the person and the tradition, while then jettisoning everything you don't like. And frankly, I don't find that attractive. And I don't find that even particularly inspiring, or even in my worst moments, not even respectable. It's because it seems to me that Christianity really does hang together. There is a kind of ecology of Christian thought and practice. There is a definable way of being Christian that starts with Jesus and the apostles, that is quite clear throughout Christian history, that is quite clear in global Christianity today. And if you don't opt for that package, you're opting for a different religion. And this is something I'm careful where I say this, but I do think that liberal Christianity is the search for a different religious dynamic, something else, mysticism, moralism, something else, while wanting to keep the very attractive bits and pieces of Christianity that intrigue you, Christian art or high-level Christian philosophy, or keeping the music of J.S. Bach or the poetry of T.S. Eliot. And that's very much the mood of our time, isn't it? Is Canadians picking and choosing what they like on the smorgasbord of cultural items, and stitching together a do-it-yourself religion. And then you can call it Christian if you like, and lots of Canadians do. But from a scholarly point of view, what they're practicing and what they're believing isn't recognizably Christian. There's no way that if you were to write down your beliefs, attitudes, and practices, you would score highly on a typical test of Christian belief and life, just like you can call yourself a Muslim. But if you don't actually follow the 5 pillars of Islam, the rest of us are entitled to doubt whether we should take you seriously as a practicing Muslim. So to me, the study of Christianity, it is an endlessly fascinating subject, but I don't find very many people who aren't serious Christians or used to be in the field.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is a live podcast in the sense that, generally speaking, I just let it roll. But I always tell people at the beginning and at the end that if they say anything that they want to have redacted, we can do redaction. We have that ability. And then I also am totally comfortable with somebody saying pass. I don't want to answer that question. But I am curious from the academic perspective, if you see people who are kind of killing it in the field, people who are putting out a lot of content, a lot of influential content into the kind of biblical fields, are they mostly, you describe them as people who are kind of in the church, or used to be in the church, or are on their way out of the church, or are trying their darndest to redefine the church? Is it a pretty even spread right now in what biblical literature is looking like? Is there somebody, one particular variety of person who is winning the day in terms of publication and influence?
I think we'd actually have to go discipline by discipline. And I know you don't want me to go too far into the weeds here, but I would say, for instance, in biblical studies per se, in academic biblical studies, the field of Old Testament and New Testament was dominated by unorthodox, unevangelical, untraditional Christianity through the 19th century and well into probably the 1960s. But since then, I would say evangelical and confessional Roman Catholic, like believing Roman Catholic biblical scholars have come more and more to the fore. Partly in membership, because in Europe and North America, liberal Christianity and mainline Christianity has lost so many members that they're just not generating very many new scholars. So more conservative or more traditional Christians are simply winning the battle for hearts and minds by propagating ourselves, so that more and more of the members who show up at the Society of Biblical Literature meetings in the States or the Canadian Society of Biblical Studies, more and more of the members are traditional Christians, because liberals aren't hanging in there. They just don't care. They're not generating the numbers. So part of it's demographics, and part of it is quality of work. So if you go with a sort of a globally recognized scholar like Tom Wright or N.T. Wright in New Testament, down the line to pretty major figures at some major places, Richard Hayes at Duke University, the late Larry Hurtado at the University of Edinburgh, now Marcus Bockmuehl at Oxford. These are all evangelical or pretty close to evangelical Christians at major places. So biblical studies is quite a contested field now across the board. Interestingly, in philosophy, conservative Catholic and evangelical Protestants, broadly speaking, are really quite dominant in the philosophy of religion under the inspirational leadership of people like the late Bill Alston, and now the superannuated and retired figures like Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff, people just a little bit behind them like Eleanor Stump, people like Richard Swinburne at Oxford. So that field is actually fairly dominated by believing Christians, with atheists and skeptics more or less on their back foot in the last generation. In church history, it's a mixed bag, but lots of traditional believers there. And in fact, in the North American scene, the study of evangelicalism, which has been championed largely by evangelical historians, has become one of the most fruitful fields in North American religious history, particularly in the United States, but also somewhat here in Canada, just since the 1970s or 80s. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting time, as you were suggesting before, it's an interesting time to be a pretty traditional church-going Christian like myself in the academy in these fields. Now, in theology, in systematic theology, I would say this isn't a great generation for interesting formative theology. There's lots of, I would say, second tier, third tier, fourth tier stuff that's going on. There aren't great theologians. I mean, probably the greatest living theologian in reputation is Jürgen Moltmann. I don't think Moltmann said anything interesting for some long time. And Eberhard Jungels passed away, John Webster passed away, and even they weren't among the very greats. But it is a time in which evangelical and Catholic Christians are enjoying, I think, new creative possibilities in theology. We're a little less defensive than we used to be, Mark, and that's defensiveness really kills a scholarly investigation and conversation. We do have to be vigilant against error, but at the same time, if we are too nervous, then we can't risk creative thought. And more of that is now happening. And I think it's going to happen more as Christianity continues to burgeon around the globe, so that we're going to have Korean theologians and Nigerian theologians and Ecuadorian theologians who not only had studied at the West's good schools, which has happened for a couple of generations now, but start to come out of their own schools. I think your generation and the next couple of generations are going to see some very interesting theology as the Christian gospel is refracted through these various cultural prisms.
That's good. Yeah. Mike Bird actually just posted today about a number of these different kind of theologies from overseas, and kind of challenging our preconceptions about always thinking that good theology has to come from the West. But I think a snapshot of that can be like, yeah, you're right, it should. But it could also be a bit of a surface read to be like, unless they're producing like content that we can understand, then our dialogue isn't going to be very, very fruitful. And so that's why, translation, but also like, even what's the format? Like, are they inclined to be writing treatises on these things, or is it very kind of just folk understanding how it's been passed from time to time? Because Christianity is not new is not really new in very many places at this point in time, but the dialogues that we're having with each other, that's kind of what's new. And so kind of understanding how we can increase the fruitfulness of that dialogue. Now, you keep using a word that I think a lot of people probably think should almost be censored. Frankly, it's borderline offensive at this point in time, which is the word evangelical. And I know that we don't want to talk about this a lot, but I have to ask this question because I'm really personally very interested. I said, Mike Bird, actually, one of the things that made me finally say I have to speak to Mr. Stackhouse was when I saw your interview with Mike Bird about evangelicalism and kind of what it is. And I still, though, don't know if I fully understand what evangelical. So I'll put it this way: I don't know if I'm an evangelical. Like I don't know. Like, is anybody listening to this? Is my job on the line? Like I don't know what that. I do know that I'm a Wesleyan. Like I'm denominationally locked in there, card carrying, if you will. I know I'm a Christian. I know that I'm a Protestant, even though I lean ecumenical. But I don't know what evangelicalism is. It's one of the things, maybe you could know it when you see it, but there doesn't seem to be like a governing body or a litmus test. And so like you've tried to, I feel like you're trying to give some language to that, as not necessarily like an IQ test that you can just take and in 3 easy steps determine whether or not you're an evangelical, but in brief, can you help clarify that? And then also say why we should keep using that word when so many people really wish that we didn't.
Yeah, part of the challenge for me as a scholar of evangelicalism is indeed to try to say, okay, hundreds of pages later, dude, like I don't have time to read hundreds of pages of your definition of evangelicalism. What's portable? What can I carry around with me? And definitions should do work. They should be useful in some way, right? They should accomplish something. Some people use definitions of evangelical because they're trying to rule people out. They're people they don't like their religion, they don't like the way they are, and so they try to say, this is evangelical, this is a good thing, and you're not that, and you're out, right? Other people are trying to build political coalitions. They're trying to influence the government. They're trying to win, tax relief from the CRA. So they want to look as big as possible, right? They want their tribe to look as influential as possible. They want votes and dollars to speak for them. So they define evangelicalism in such a way that they get as many people in as they can. And some of that's happened actually in the history of the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States, and to a lesser extent, but to some extent here in Canada with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Like we want to look as big as possible, so we make certain claims that maybe we shouldn't make. I would say this. I would say that I can tell you whether you're an evangelical, Mark. So I'll sort that out for you, depending on just a few questions. If you count yourself a Protestant, which you do, because you said you're a Wesleyan, I think there are equivalents to what I'm going to say in Catholic and Orthodox circles, but evangelicalism has typically seen itself as Protestant. Some people think they can find evangelicals among Roman Catholics. I think they either are using bad definitions or they're finding crypto-Protestants in Catholic circles, which I think exist nowadays. But for now, I'll just keep myself to the Protestant circle. So if you're already in a Protestant circle, I think there's actually only 3 kinds of Protestants that are, frankly, 3 styles, I would say, 3 ways of being Protestant. One is conservative, and these would be Protestants who grow up in a particular tradition, and their understanding of that tradition is that this is right, and our obligation is to receive the tradition from the past and hand it on faithfully to the next generation. We've got it right, so here's what we need to do, and here's what we need to be. And they're what I would call traditional or conservative Christians in a Protestant mode. The other would be liberal Christians. And these are Christians who feel free. Liberal means to feel free. We get our word liberty from the same root. They feel free to keep or reject anything in the tradition that is on the table. And their general approach to Christianity is to accept or reject whatever they like. And fundamentally, liberalism in the last couple of hundred years has been a combination of what I call moralism, trying to do the right things, trying to be for justice and rectitude and so on, and mysticism, spiritual connection with God in some way. What liberalism generally isn't is a salvation religion, where God needs to do something for me. In fact, God needs to do something decisive for me in the person of Jesus Christ. And liberalism generally doesn't say that. Of all the varieties of liberalism, what they generally don't say is that God has been in Christ reconciling the world to himself. What they'll say instead is that Jesus was a very, 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 very good man who shows us what it's like to be open to God and live a Christian life, right back to the granddaddy of all liberals in Friedrich Schleiermacher. And I studied Schleiermacher with one of the world's great experts on Schleiermacher, Brian Garish, at the University of Chicago. So I'm pretty confident that I'm not doing liberalism a disservice by saying this, even though not all liberals will thank me for this. So there's conservative traditional Christianity. And examples of that would be like prayer book Anglicans. We want the same service every week out of the prayer book, preferably from a couple centuries ago. And this is the right religion, and we keep doing it week after week after week, right? Because certain conservative Lutherans would be like that. Certain conservative Mennonites would be like that, right? Even certain Wesleyans would be like that. Like, this is the way Father Wesley did things. This is the way we should do it, world without end. Liberals, we do whatever we like, whatever we think is right. In between would be vital Protestantism. Protestantism that has head, hands, and heart all engaged. I want to think well. I want to feel what I should feel. I want to do what God wants me to do. And I want to be active in the world as an obedient disciple of Jesus Christ. I'm open to change when it comes to mode. I'm open to new technologies. I'm open to podcasts. I'm open to computers. I'm open to science. I'm open to change in worship style. I'm willing to preach in the street corners as well as in church pulpits. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get the gospel out and to help people come to Jesus and grow up in living faith into maturity, while at the center of this is the timeless gospel of Jesus Christ as taught in the authoritative scriptures. And you say, yeah, well, that all just sounds like vital, authentic, basic Christianity. Yes, that's right. That's what evangelicalism is. It is there isn't a fourth or fifth subdivision of that. So I'm lumping into this evangelical category lots of people who don't like the term evangelical, but I don't really care, because as a historian, as a scholar, I'm looking for types. I'm looking for ways of defining groups. And in fact, in this middle zone, historically, over the last couple of hundred years, people in that zone do recognize each other as kin. They may or may not have a lot to do with each other, but they recognize each other as kin. Here in Moncton, there are all sorts of informal but genuine connections between, say, the Wesleyan church that you serve in, both the denomination and the congregation, and the Baptist University that I teach in. And there's fraternal, friendly relationships between our university and Kingswood University, the Wesleyan school up the road. I've been there a couple of times to lecture, and they send students our way. So we're not the same, but we recognize that at some crucial level we are. And we're in a common cause, serving a common Lord. We disagree about modes of baptism. We disagree about how to run a church. We disagree about which songs we should sing on Sunday morning. And we fairly vehemently can disagree about those things, but we disagree as family. We disagree as people who still recognize each other as, in fact, genuine Christians going about the mission of God. Now, there's always cranky people around there who don't like that, but they are actually moving into fundamentalism, which is the hard edge, intolerant side, not just conservative. That's the intolerant side of evangelicalism, would be fundamentalism, where everything has to be my way or get lost. But that's a pathological version of the evangelical sense, that on the core commitments, not just the doctrines, but the core commitments, right? We all love Jesus. We're all Trinitarian, but we also love the Bible as the authoritative word of God. We're all about conversion, helping other people come to Christ and growing up in maturity in Christ, full sanctification. All evangelicals are interested in that. Doesn't matter the denomination. You can look, they're all interested in that. We're all, in a sense, singing from the same hymn book. In fact, all of our hymn books have Charles Wesley in them, because we do recognize at some important level our kinship. So I would say for lots of people today who are understandably nervous about the term evangelical, even repelled by it because of the way they've seen it linked to certain political outlooks, to certain moral outlooks, I'd say, you know what? You're probably upset about white nationalism in America, or you're upset about racism, which you should be, or you're upset about fundamentalism, which you should be. But you really don't have any argument with the historic mainstream of vital Protestant Christianity, because there really isn't a better term for that than evangelicalism. And in fact, historically, I can show you that your heritage is somewhere in here, including the Wesleyan.
Yeah, well, you're probably right. I mean, just really pegged it. It's almost like you're an expert. But yeah, so it's like, so what reformed and always reforming? Like, is that that's not necessarily evangelical, but I mean, like, would you think that would be a pretty good? Because that's what I'm hearing is, in some respects, it's this kind of middle, not just that centrism is always the right way, but it is, like you said, this kind of middle between conservatism, something that's completely calcified, and liberalism, something that's completely liquefied, that has no edges whatsoever. But by that definition, then it can't be static. Like, it has to incarnate all along the way. So evangelicalism of today can't be the same evangelicalism. It can't look, I guess, exactly like the same evangelicalism of 100 years ago, 50 years ago.
That's right. Because one of the definitions I add when I look at one of the standard definitions by the English historian David Bebbington has sort of a four-fold definition. I've added a couple to that. I've modified a couple things David said. I don't think that we're crucicentric, like he says, focused on the cross. I think if you look at the evangelical literature, and David knows it very, very well, but I think he oversimplified here. We're Trinitarian. I mean, evangelicals right back to John and Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards. These are Holy Spirit people almost as much as they're Jesus people. And they're not just focused on the cross. They're focused on the resurrection, and they're focused on the new birth. They're focused on the Holy Spirit in a very powerful way, and on the ongoing ministry of a risen Lord, not just on a crucified Savior. So I think the Trinitarian, I think we are conversionist, we are biblicist, we are missional. All of those things are just modifications of what David was saying. But evangelicals are also strongly pragmatic. Evangelicalism, like Protestantism generally, like, we do what we need to do to get the job done. And if radio was the way to get the word out most effectively in a particular culture, that's great. But if television comes along, we'll use television as well. And if podcasts come along, we'll use that as well, right? We're not just going to hold Sunday evening gospel services in the parking lot of the shopping mall the way we might have done in the 1970s, because nobody goes shopping in the mall. And certainly nobody's going to drive by on a summer evening and stop by a church service. That's just kind of pathetic, right? To keep doing that kind of thing. Similarly, we're not just pragmatic, we're populist. And evangelicals are very much people who try to listen to what the Spirit's saying, not only through the experts, but through the common folk in the pew, through where lay interest is. So while there's a dark side to that, where evangelicalism can cultivate a cult of celebrity and a cult of sheer popularity as the sole ground to justify somebody's ministry. Look how big his church is. there's also something to that in terms of the evangelical understanding of the priesthood of all believers, that everybody has the Spirit, not just the guys with doctor in front of their names or MDiv after their names. And where the Spirit is blowing, we'd like to think the Christians are following. So it's a more tricky, interesting question about popularity and what I'm calling populism, the grounding of authority in whether you have a real audience of real Christians to evangelicalism. And yes, then I think what it really does mean, Mark, is that tomorrow we are going to preach the same essential gospel that we preach today, but we're going to probably do that in a different way and possibly in a different spot.
Yeah, I find that, so I do think you pegged me, but I must say that I as I get older, and I think this is just phenomenologically what happens to almost everybody, but as I get older, maybe you're bucking the trend, I find myself leaning more towards this calcification thing. I'm more curmudgeonly. I want things to be a little bit more the way these, and now, so I understand that about myself, but then I also look objectively, or what I think is objectively, it's probably not at all, and just think, how does this end? How does constantly redefining and reevaluating and just changing and shifting almost everything over and over again, like how this seems tiring, and every once in a while I feel tired. I really would love, if I had extra time, to ask you about conversionism. Maybe we'll sign up some other time and I'll just be like, just tell me everything about conversionism, because this is a fascinating topic. In worship music, which is kind of like where I spend a lot of my time, I'm realizing that we keep singing all these songs about who we are. And I actually don't think we don't need to poo-poo on anyone or anything, but like, I don't think that's actually categorically bad. I just finished reading St. Teresa of Avila, Interior Castle. And the whole time through, she's describing what it is to go into the self and further in to find the light that's within. And so, she's a Catholic nun. Never once is there anything about conversion. However, she's writing only to Catholic nuns. Those are the only people who she would have ever thought would have read this book. Those people who are, they're not just like nominal Christians. They left it all to join a house and to just pour themselves into serving God. So if there is conversion, they would well have assumed that conversion had happened at this point in time. And I think the same thing happens with a lot of our worship songs. Is we are giving theology that is accurate and helpful. And yet we don't always, because of maybe people's inability is not the right word, because they don't necessarily constantly come to, the average churchgoer, even before COVID, was going a couple times a month, not every single week, right? It's like sometimes you're hopping in the middle of the movie, like, what did I miss? And so if you sing about all these things that you are in Christ without ever having an opportunity to understand that you first need to somehow become enfolded into Christ, then you can make these declarations of who you are without ever actually signing on the dotted line. And so the question of conversionism becomes something that I think is interesting, and I would love to tease out more. But your book, this book, Can I Believe? If you're writing in Canada, because I'm presuming that you were in Canada when it was published in 2019, so just ahead of these last couple of years of madness. But as you were writing, who were you picturing in your mind's eye? Who was the audience for this book?
Yeah, it came out a little bit later than that. I think 2020, maybe 2019. Maybe you're right, Mark.
I thought the copyright said that one.
Might have.
One of the few words I read.
Yeah. Well, that's good, and it's not an unimportant word. The book's something I've wanted to have in my hands for a long time. And there's a couple of books I've written that I wrote simply because I kept waiting for someone better to write them, and nobody did. All my life, since I was an undergraduate, I've been wanting a book that would help me think better as a Christian. What does it mean to think about everything in a Christian way instead of just in a default, secular way? I kept waiting for a book like that, and I realized what I was looking for was an epistemology, a way of thinking about things. And finally, one of my favorite epistemologists, Nick Wolterstorff, said, no, you should write that. So I did. And I wrote a book called Need to Know that really hasn't sold well. And it's because part of the title's not great, but also because it's a little more academic than my target audience will want. So I have a contract now with my publisher to write a more popular book, which I'm just calling How to Think as a Christian. It's just going to be called How to Think as a Christian. So I'll try to get another version of that out that's going to be a little more useful. Similarly, with this book, I wanted a book that you could put in the hands of a smart, inquiring friend. I mean, I'm an academic. I've gone to school a long time. A lot of my friends are well-educated people. And most Christian books are aimed at the middle of the bell curve, right? They're aimed here where the biggest audience is. So that's going to be people with high school, a little bit of college education in North America. So some education, to be sure, but pretty popular, pretty easy reading. Everybody's busy. Maybe you only get 10 or 15 minutes a day to actually read a book. So most podcasts, most bloggers, most books are aimed right there. And that's fine if that's what you're trying to do, is to reach most of the people most of the time. But over toward this end, in terms of education and culture, where were the books that you could give to that really annoying 18-year-old in your college group who asks all the hard questions? Where's the book you can give to your brother-in-law who's been a difficult skeptic at every Thanksgiving you've ever been to? Where's the book for your smart teacher who actually seems to be spiritually interested, but really is despairing of dumb Christianity? And so I deliberately decided when I wanted to write a popular apologetic that it wasn't going to be too popular, that it was going to be aimed at people who might read the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the Walrus, people who were interested in broader culture, who didn't need to be told that Socrates was a philosopher, who didn't need to be told that Anne Frank was an important figure in the Second World War. And so with clues like that, I talked to a publisher and they said, yeah, we're willing to try a book like that. And so this book, Can I Believe? Christianity for the Hesitant, is the book that, frankly, you could give to friends that previously you might have given C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity to. Now, C.S. Lewis is a genius, and I'm certainly not. And this is the most popular, Mere Christianity is the most popular apologetic of the 20th century. And my book certainly won't be the most popular apologetic probably in Moncton. But Lewis, who's a personal hero of mine, is writing in the middle of the Second World War. And that's a long time ago now. And a lot of the cultural expectations of mid-war Britain aren't our expectations in North America today. And some of Lewis's attitudes that show up in Mere Christianity actually would turn people off, particularly his response toward men and women and married couples and so on. I found students that are increasingly irritated by Lewis and less entranced by him, as I have been. So there have been some really good attempts to write books like this, Alistair McGrath and Tim Keller and Tom Wright himself. But each of those books, it seemed to me, still seemed fairly churchy and seemed to really be speaking largely to Christians, even though they said they weren't. But I've had a chance at the University of Manitoba to teach religion to non-Christians for quite a while. It's been my privilege to do a lot of work with mainstream media. And literally next week, my next podcast will be the CBC. And I get a chance to talk in public, as well as with folks like you, about the Christian faith. So this book is that kind of book. And I've gotten people to endorse it who are people that other non-Christians would find, oh, that's interesting that a professor of philosophy at Princeton would recommend the book, or a professor of nanomaterials at Oxford would endorse this book, or a well-known Muslim activist like Irshad Manji would endorse this book. That's not your typical Christian apologetic. So I'm trying to reach an atypical non-Christian audience.
Yeah. I mean, it seems, as I said, as I was kind of going through it, I mean, it seems fairly systematic. And then at the end, I mean, in the closing, one of the interesting things that you say here is, and this is the brunt of it. Like, this is probably one of the biggest challenges, but you can't really avoid it, right? It says, it's impossible to fully imagine what it's like to live as a Christian before you've actually done it a while. And so that is such a brilliant invitation at the end, which gives you the opportunity. Like there's this, I've never read the article, but I've heard it referenced about 100 times. This article by a philosopher called how to be what it's like to be a bat. And it's just this kind of the idea that, for anybody who hasn't at least heard it referenced, that no matter what, you can't really know what it's like to be a bat. You can think what it would be like to fly around. You could think what it'd be like to close your eyes and to hear sounds bouncing around. But even if you had all of the same, like, even if they could somehow figure out how to Frankenstein you into somehow like a bat's body, you still actually wouldn't be a bat, right? You'd have a brain that's more like yours. You'd have thought processes. You'd have a life that's like yours. So like to actually be something else is impossible until or unless you become that something else. And that's the experiential aspect of Christianity that I guess we couldn't avoid talking about conversionism, could we? Is that it's still like it's something kind of beyond the veil until you actually kind of walk through that veil, or have the veil torn for you, probably more accurately, right?
Well, we do have that kind of thing, don't we, in life, that people routinely tell couples in love that you really can't tell what it's like to be married till you're married. Mm-hmm. It's a cliche that you really don't know what it's like to have a kid till you have a kid. Amen. And I'm the father of 3 boys, and I was kind of weary of those cliches before we had our kids, thinking, well, I mean, how different can it be? Oh boy, is it different, right? Oh boy, it's just, and it's not really like anything else, but it's sort of kind of like some other things. So if you've done some counseling at camp, and you spent all summer counseling kids at camp, that starts to get at, the sleep deprivation, the ups and downs emotionally. If you've done babysitting, especially with the same family for a while, you start to feel that way. So you can get some insight into that, and that's considerably more insight than I had as a young man getting married, who hadn't done much babysitting and hadn't done much counseling. And so, childcare came as unending delight, I should say, unending delight for me. And that's what everyone can look for. That's right. Any of you prospective parents out there, it's just a joy-filled romp. Nonetheless, it isn't like we can approximate that. And that's part of what I'm trying to say at the end of the book, right? Is that you've got to try it out as a way of life. Christianity isn't just 5 snappy answers to 5 difficult questions. It's not just a correct description of reality that you should, as a thoughtful person, accept, which is the way a lot of apologists seem to treat it. They say, this is a set of ideas that all right-thinking people should adopt. Well, it kind of is, but it's a map that's trying to get you to a destination. It's about embarking on a journey with a particular company of people following a particular master toward a particular end. So Christianity is indeed a conversion to a different way of being a human being, and in fact becoming an optimally functional human being. It's the way to what we all want. It is the way to eternal life. It is the way to eternal youth. It is the way to utopia. It really is those things. It really does exist. It's just a very hard road, and it's a very peculiar road. And the fact that we're in semi-Christian Canada dulls a lot of our contemporaries to how strange Christianity is. So part of the burden of this book is to re-strangify the Christian religion, to realize that this is a very odd story. And it's really surprising that anybody believes it, let alone 2 billion people. What's going on there? And that's part of the challenge of the book, is to try to say, this is what's going on, and here's why these people find it to be the way, the truth, and the life.
Beautiful. Well, if any of you are listening have that 18-year-old student who's kind of just, he won't stop asking you questions, is kind of annoying, or like you said, the brother-in-law who seems to be ruining Thanksgiving dinner, then Can I Believe might be the book for you. And it might not just be the book for them. It's, sometimes it works to hand somebody a book, sometimes it doesn't. But if you wrestle through the process, that's part of the thing, especially if you've kind of grown up in the church and you don't really know what it's like. It's kind of it's the reverse process. You actually don't know what it's like to not be somebody who has been steeped in faith, right? Like I don't know what it's like to have to kind of walk through life either comfortable in my kind of agnosticism or atheism, or, actually uncomfortable with it. Either way, I've never had it, right? I've had the background radiation of God throughout my whole life. And so to be able to interact with and read some people who are helping frame that experience for us so that we have the ability to kind of have that a little bit of insight. You might not be able to know what it's like to be a bat, but you can eat a couple of mosquitoes and it gives you a bit of a flavor for it, I suppose. Listen, I just truly appreciated your time today, sir. We didn't even get a chance to talk about your highly provocative article that you dropped on us. Man, if time was endless, we talked about this article about Christians and civil disobedience, which I will definitely tag in this in the show description. And I don't. Sadly, this week is a very full one for me because of an arts festival that I've got going on at our church, which I'm not sad about. I'm super psyched about it, but it will mean that this podcast will not be coming out this week. And so I don't know what the world would be like in 2 weeks. Hopefully we're all still here, but Maranatha, come Lord Jesus, either way, it'll be fine. But that, and then also, someday down the road, we'll talk about worship music a little bit more. You seem to not be afraid to have provocative opinions about worship music as well. And so I enjoy having friendly, measured conversations with people who actually have strong, sometimes countercultural opinions. Those are fun. Those are fun conversations as long as people have them together. So appreciate your time, sir.
Good to talk to you, Mark.
Talk soon.